I'm Virginia Reeves, as Joe mentioned, and I am a proud member of the Library Foundation Board. I'm honored to get to share the stage with Melissa this evening, and I'm just going to give a quick introduction, biography of Melissa, and then invite her out here. So, as many of you probably know, Melissa Kwasny is the author of 6 books of poetry, most recently Where Outside the Body is the Soul Today, which is an incredible title, and Pictograph, as well as a collection of prose writings, Earth Recitals. She's the editor of Toward the Open Field, Poets on the Art of Poetry, and co-editor with M.L. Smoker of the anthology I Go to the Ruined Place, Contemporary Poets in Defense of Global Human Rights. Recently published by Trinity University Press, you got it right, Joe, Putting on the Dog, The Animal Origins of What We Wear is her first book of investigative nonfiction. Melissa is the recipient of the Poetry Society of America's Cecil Hemley Award and Alice Faye D. Costanola Award for a Work in Progress, the Montana Art Council's Artist Innovation Award, residencies at the Vermont Studio Center, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, Hedgebrook, and the Headland Center for the Arts. She has taught as visiting writer at both the undergraduate and graduate level, including MFA programs at the University of Wyoming, Eastern Washington University, Inland Pacific Center for Writers, and the University of Montana. She lives outside of Jefferson City, Montana, in the Elkhorn Mountains. Please join me in welcoming Melissa to the stage. Okay, these chairs are literally from my living room. I wanted a comfortable feeling for tonight's evening, and so I brought my own chairs. It's more information than you probably need. As Joe mentioned, this is our third Writer's Journey event. Each of them have looked differently, and this is our first interview style. And as I said, I'm just thrilled to get to share the stage with this exceptional person and writer. So, Melissa, we're going to start off, and I'm just going to ask you what drove you to writing. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, and I will have the conversation with you, but I just want to say there are so many people in the audience, and I can't see you because there's lights in my eyes, but there are so many people I love in this audience, and so many people who have supported me in my writing career since way before I got my first poem published even. And I'm just grateful for that support and for you being here tonight. It's really quite an honor. Thank you.
I would say the other half of the audience, I could say the exact same thing about supporting me. So thank you. Yes, thank you everyone for being here. So let's talk about growing up and what led you to writing.
Yeah. As I told Margaret Lincoln in the article, we had a short interview a couple weeks ago, and she was asking me about my home life, and everybody's different. Every writer is different. For me, I think it's kind of unlikely that I would become a writer. But in my family household, we had bookshelves. And there were knickknacks on the bookshelves, and the phone was on the bookshelf, but there were no books on the bookshelf. Not because my family didn't believe in books, but they worked all the time. My paternal grandparents were both from Poland. My maternal grandparents were tenant farmers in northern Indiana, and my parents were co-owners of my Polish grandparents' bar. And so they were bar owners, so they worked all the time, and so they didn't have time to read. But my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, read to me a lot, and I loved being read to. Like most writers, I think you're a reader first, before you become a writer, and I was definitely a passionate reader. My grandmother, I think I was about 8, and she paid for me to join a book club, and in those days, you got these little catalogs, and then you would get one book in a month, and it would come, and it would be wrapped in newsprint, and it was just so exciting to undo the tape and look at it. So I read a lot of classics when I was young because of that, because of my grandmother, Lena. But I didn't think about writing. I just thought there was beauty there, beauty in this literature, and I think most people are kind of searching for some kind of beauty when they're a child, and so then I got a library card, and that was it. Then I went to the library all the time and started reading a lot. But when I started writing was when I was I think I was a freshman in high school, and I just have to plug public schools. At that time, I had great teachers. I feel like in my whole life I've had so many mentors, unlikely mentors, and people that were mentors in different ways than we think of it. That someone just grabs your hand and says, "Oh, you're a genius," and I'm gonna pave the way for you. But more like opened the world for me. And so I had a teacher when I was a freshman who had a PhD in Chaucer studies. And he would come in and he would just recite Chaucer in the classroom. And of course, we didn't understand one word of it, right? But I thought it was magic speech. I thought it was language that wasn't in the kind of way that we use it as commerce, as an exchange as transactional. It was language that was musical. And so I fell in love with it. And he had us writing poems in the classroom. And I wrote just dreadful poems. But I made them, right? And so I love them, and I won't. Because I had never made anything like that with language before, it stuck with me, and so I started secretly writing. I kept secret notebooks with poems in them, and someone gave me a book of Whitman, and I started reading, Song of Myself, and getting more intoxicated by it all, and that's how it started.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I'd like to just continue this because when I say that I didn't take a traditional, I don't know what that is, route for becoming a writer, but I had good luck. And one thing that happened was that I was writing, but also my senior year I worked nights in a factory, in a plastics factory, so that I could save up money because I knew I wanted to go to college. I'm the first person in my extended family to go to college, and I wanted to save money up, so I was working nights, and I wanted to get out of Indiana, so I went to the library, and I researched the cheapest out-of-state tuition in the country, and Montana, and New Mexico came up as and I applied to both of them and got in, and decided for Montana. And the first, I think, semester I was there, a friend of mine found my book of poems and said, "Do you know you're at one of the best writing schools in the country?" And of course I didn't. And then Richard Hugo teaches here. You should ask him if you could take one of his classes. And so I did. And in the first class, I was bringing in all these poems that were my dreadful poems, but also were about my family and about working in the factory. And with what I mean by luck is I had Richard Hugo, who grew up in White Center, who knew factory work, who knew people like my people. Up until that time, I didn't even know that poets actually, that you could be a poet, or that a poet was alive, and what poet wasn't something, that died out in England. And here was this real live poet who said, keep writing this, I love this. And so he was my first formal mentor. So very lucky to have met him.
Oh, it's an amazing story. It reminds me, and you've met Lauren Graham, who teaches at Carroll. Is Lauren here? All of you speak to him about that, please. He grew up in rural Oklahoma and has a similar, that he was the first in his family to go to college, and this realization of the beauty of words and finding that as this different life.
Yeah, I think because I've taught so long, I see so many people who are afraid of poetry because they're not allowed to see that strangeness or that beauty in it. They're supposed to know what it means. And so a lot of times love of poetry gets cut off because you thought you knew what it meant, but the teacher told you that that's not what it meant, right? It really means this, and so then you feel stupid. So instead, you just hear it. Who knows what it means? Poets often don't know what it means.
It's a secret. Try to keep
They
writers
know
in
this
general.
much of what it means, but like any good art, it reverberates and it gets larger. Because of the audience that reads it. So.
And you've worked with, I'm going kind of off script here, but you've worked with, I know you've done workshops with younger students, and that's part of the work you're doing as poet laureate, is traveling and meeting with students of different ages. But I've found in my work, doing writers in the schools, that poetry actually is really accessible as a form to young people. If you give them that freedom, if you show them, if you give them that rein, right, and that
Right.
like let them run with it and find the beauty and play with the language.
Right, because the most important thing with any art, I think, in painting or I'm not sure about music, I'm not a musician, but in poetry, is the key is there's no wrong way to do it, and that's liberating. All you have to say is, if this could happen, then what? And there's no wrong answer to that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, since we're talking about the beauty of poetry, would you read a little bit for us? Possibly, my personal request is Choke Cherries,
Okay,
and then another.
Okay. Yeah, Virginia asked me to read this poem because her daughter likes this poem. And I think that's just so cool that your daughter knows you know.
She's here in the audience. Yes, this poem is, she doesn't just like this poem, it is tacked to the wall in her bedroom.
Excuse me. This comes from my second book of poetry called Thistle, and each one of the poems in here is takes as its focus a kind of herb or plant that grows here in Montana. So this is choke cherries. The crow call this time of year the black cherry moon, when the rose hips are blood bright, spattered on their overwrought stems, and the creek calls so clearly in words almost our own as we come sliding down the bank. Last night we covered the gardens in plastic. The chickadees were back after their wide diet of summer. We ate the last trout, its spine curved from disease. So much can go wrong. I want to know what you will promise me as our hands reach in and in through the copper the carmine leaves. I know you are lonely, alone with your grief for your parents who are not my parents, for your life which, despite all, is not my life. The cherries are thick here, hanging in clusters, purple-black from frost. It has started to rain, and I am chilled by it. Each day we promise we will talk of our fears of intimacy, how we still expect to be hurt when we love. You bring me a coat from the back of the truck, but I want to stop our task now, to sit in the cab of the truck while the gray spills, slick with thunder. What if I kissed you there in depth? After so many years, I can misunderstand the difference between instinct and obligation, how my hand continues to grasp the stems. Keats said, poems should come easy as leaves off the trees, but see how they cling and wrestle with their ties. And now the sun shines. It is not this grace I had imagined. When Keats said poems, I meant love. The choke cherries roll easily into my palm, then fall into the plastic bag that binds my wrist. Over and over until we have enough, until our fingers are bruised with their dark juices.
Talk a little bit about your connection to the earth and nature. And in one of our conversations, and maybe I'm just going to steal your answer from you, but you spoke of a deep love for the non-human world. And I'd just love to hear you talk about that. And if you can trace where that came from, or where that love came from. I think it comes through very clearly in a lot of your work.
That would take too long.
Okay, moving on.
I just want to say most of my writing life has been focused in some way, in different ways, in the idea of communicating and having a relationship with the non-human world. And like all poets do, listening for another voice, listening to see if there is another voice in some kind of reciprocity. And so I just say that, not to say that that's a simple question, but that I've been looking at ways to do that in my writing life. For instance, in my writing, in the first book, that I had a whole section, Archival Birds, a whole section where I was doing that with different kinds of trees. And thistle would be more closer to the ground, herbs and things that I felt like I could bow to. And then I got very interested in what the history of human relationship with plants and animals is. So I started reading a lot about transcendentalism and the German Romantics. My book, Reading of Alice in Montana, was trying to think about the things that the Romantics talked about, which is in a nutshell, this idea of correspondences, that there's a correspondence between something that's alive here, a tree, and the spirit of the tree. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I was here in Montana, learning from my friends who are Native, reading lots of Native poetry and novels, which happen to be something that I really learned from and loved. And so how do I think about these philosophies of how people have had relationships with the non-human world? And of course it gets increasingly, seems increasingly more important to be able to salvage some kind of relationship, given what we're going through now. So it probably started in just sitting, in my grandparents' lilac grove when I was a kid, just staring at just looking out, looking at things, and then became a real passion, interest, study.
All of those, all three of those. Would you like to share the dear people?
Yeah, I would. In what I just said, that idea of, in a lot of the Native literature and some of the lessons I learned, there's this idea of the four-legged people or the two-legged people, or the, that kind of idea of forms of nature, forms of life other than human life, being people. And at the time in my last book, I had been reading a lot of this, I have lots of interests, this Sufi scholar named Henry Corbin, who was talking about their kind of, he called them visionary recitals, where they would connect with their forms of life. And there was this quote in one of the books where it said, if you really want to know what the earth is, if you really want to have a connection with the earth, you're asking the wrong question, what is the earth? The question should be, who is the earth? Who are the waters? Who is the mountain? And that has been something that really struck me, that kind of intention. So in this book, I have a lot of poems that are called the deer people, the water people, the wind people, the blue heron people, all kinds of things like that. But this is the first one. I just wanted to read this, the deer people. Stumbled under the shade of birds, scratched a little hollow in the dirt and hid the rings there. Moved quiet and alone among the others, as if through snow, wearing the sage wristbands. Considered sunshine and its synonyms, considered its antonym, the ebbing tide, spotlit, entered from the wings. Stepped into a spirit world where the natural show themselves, wearing a guise of the same. Disconnected little dreams, false continuum, often a complete and common shyness. To candle is to examine an egg's freshness by holding it to the light, hole in the ozone, hole in the soul's tallow lining. That grown men can hold their guns to the soft belly of a child, that they can shoot someone who is so afraid. The violence we have allowed to blow through us, locked bedroom door bucking in its casement. Considered peace and its synonym, the white-tailed doe and her fawn, crossed the field of the mind, meadow-wise. To ask a question is a promise that one will listen, how the fur is within the fire, wind in the windrow. Saw not particulars but glow, fed off the nose, cleared the air of all but the smell of clover.
And then to ask a question is to promise to listen to the answer. We don't have to. that's, I think, we often ask and don't
listen.
listen to the response or that we've asked for.
Yeah, you have to be quiet to listen. And one thing that a touchstone for me that I've carried with me, I have little notebooks that I carry, just quotes from people that I love. And Denise Levertov has this in her book, Poets, The Poet in the World. She says, reverence for life. She says, the progression seems clear to me from reverence of life to attention to life, from attention to life to a highly developed hearing and seeing, from hearing and seeing to form, from form to song. And I've always remembered that if you really love something or respect it, you have to pay attention to it. But that's and how do we pay attention? We pay attention through our five senses. So the best way to learn how to be a writer is to really refine those senses. Like, what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? Because those are developed skills. There's like, oh, you have a great imagination. Well, imagination, you're not just, everybody's born with the imagination, but it's there to practice and to develop. And so I think that's what I really like thinking
I love
about.
that. Yeah. I'm gonna have you repeat that for me. And sure, won't make you all wait for that while I write it down, but yeah. Did you take notes? I want to talk about the balance between isolation, this is similar, I think it leads into or flows from the idea of listening. But I've noticed also in a lot of your work, and I think in a lot of work that I really love, and I think also just the work of the human condition, is this work to find balance between isolation and socialization, introversion and extroversion. And I suppose my question is how you balance that, and in these two sides of there's your writing life, which is pretty solitary, that creative process, and then something like this, which is there are these people watching us, and so how have you balanced that in your career?
Yeah. And I'm going to answer that for me because I think everybody does it differently, and there's not. One thing that I know about myself is I can't write in a cafe. Like, I look at people bring their notebook in a cafe and the music is going and people are talking and they're just thriving there. And I really do need quiet. And so as Roka said, that if you want to be a writer, you first have to ask yourself, must I write? And if the answer is yes, then you have to arrange your life according to that necessity. So I have arranged my life in ways that, because I'm a slow writer actually, where I have lots of time and lots of quiet, and very little money. And so everybody's got a balance with that, right? Time or money or quiet, or job, and so I've arranged my life so that I also think of it as an act of resistance. That there's more important things than just money. That there is having time to go and look at the choke cherry for a week. And that's important to me. So I think that those kind of choices I've made pretty much throughout my life. I know what I can't do.
I think that
it's been a pretty great life.
Yeah, good. eavesdropping. FYI, if you ever see me writing in a cafe, I'm just writing down what you're saying. I'm not writing anything original.
Yeah, you have to watch out for novelists.
You need to watch. Would you share either the outside the little cave spot or counting the senses?
Oh, yeah. Because of what we're talking about, I always think, and I'm primarily a poet, I've written a lot of different things, including fiction, and not very well, but I think one thing about poetry is that its gift is it's the language of the interior life. And so how do you protect that interior life? How do you acknowledge that you have one? How do you listen to it? I think those are really important questions, especially in our time where we're bombarded right now with so much outside that is hard to even avoid. So this is the first poem in my book, Pictograph. It's called Outside the Little Cave Spot, and I think of it as like the self is the little cave spot, the place inside that we live, and but it's also about its occasion, as they say, is the that little cave above the Hellgate Canyon pictographs out here in Hellgate Canyon outside of Helena, which I think are one of the most wonderful spots around here. Outside the little cave spot. The opening to the world is lopsided, irregular, dipping down like a lock of hair over someone's eye. Outside the cave, liquid gold, silver. Inside, as if flesh had been scraped off. Of the many ancient virtues, hope is the one you almost forgot. Limestone so dry and jagged, so pockmarked it could cut your skin. It stops you like a clock stops. You are here. From inside you see that you are often unkind to others. You shake hands without taking off your gloves. There is a motor of living water outside your ear. Little socket, the earth is frozen, cold and skinny and breaking down. You could lean out and lend your warmth to it. You sit here and the cries are muffled. You worry how, in the matter of a single letter reversed, a bit of food during a fast, a shade too dark for the sky paint, sacred can turn scared and cause harm. This is how large you are, a thumbprint in a cliff, how much you are asked to keep in mind.
I love the idea. I hadn't, in my reading of that poem, made like the interior self be the little cave spot, and just listen to it in that lens, and I love it. It's really beautiful. Would you like to share Counting the Senses with us?
Sure.
I'm just throwing all of this. And, well, I have more. Then we're going to talk about putting on the dog. But sorry, we have to wait. It's the new book.
Okay, so from the book before this book, it was called The Nine Senses, and so I was thinking about that when we were talking about the senses as a place to attend to the world, and we always think of those five senses. Blake calls them chief inlets of soul in this age. And so I love that idea of this is the way we not only see outside, but we see back in. And so I was reading, and I've learned that certain people think there are 9 senses, so that there are 4 more in telekinesis and clairvoyance and teleportation and telepathy. So after I did that book, I would go around reading, and people always came up to me and said, "There's more than 9." And they would tell me, they would tell me one more sense, and it was so great that I wrote this poem, even though all of the things they said aren't in here, but I thought they were so good. It's called Counting the Senses. To sense the dead around us in places where they are attached, or to sense past lives within the present one. To sense the presence of birds or animals on the roadside in the dark, or the moods of birds or animals, let alone people. There are tribes who can orient, even in the fog, naming the direction, east or west, that they are facing. There is the ability to see through lies, to feel an enemy at your back, to detect poison without taste, to douse for water. You were up before dawn, walking the shore, picking up broken bits of plastic and shell, to sense in ever-refined levels the dissipating cloud levels of oneself, what Ezra Pound named an aristocracy of emotion. In the spruce copse near the confluence, you left your hair. Last night we played Scrabble. My first word was divine. You added an S to it, doubling your score. In this very room, 14 years ago, you turned over and found the lump. Your hand rose to it, as if guided by a sense of love.
Maybe we should have saved that one for the very end. That's it. I'm going to ask you. You're going to get a chance to ask questions as well. But I am going to ask you one more question about the idea of divides, which we've kind of talked about a little bit, but the idea that, and maybe you wouldn't call them divides, but between cultures, between nature and humanity, between life and death. And I think, which could move us into the conversation of putting on a dog, which is, an exploration of relationship between humans and animals, and also a use of animals by humans. And so I don't know if I think I just talked a lot and didn't actually ask a question, but where do you see us working around that divide, and do you see, because I feel my sense in a lot of your work is that divides kind of fall away, and that we can read and become, we can sit under the choke cherries, we can be steeped in that. And am I even asking a question? Do you want to just talk about that? Divides?
No, I like that. I mean, I think that's what communication or relationship is, communication to to. And it comes back, I think, to that listening thing. One thing in putting on the dog could be considered a very divisive subject, because it's about the ways that animals have provided clothing for people, and so you have a whole bunch of people over here who will say we absolutely should not use anything that is from animals, because if we respect their beingness. And then there's people over here who might say, so what? And then there's a whole bunch of people in the middle who are really thinking about these things. And what I did in this book was I listened to those people. I'm not an expert on this subject, but I met so many people that were really asking those questions. How can we not look at something as black and white or something as good or bad, but how do we make better decisions and become more aware of things that are in the middle, or crossing opinions, relationship.
Yeah. You want to read us a little bit, just that from putting on the dog, possibly? We asked for.
Oh, sure. Yeah, oh, sure. This was really a departure, this book, for me, because I'm a poet, and doing this kind of, I've done research before, but it was a steep learning curve for me in that I had to learn, you have all these skills, but I had to learn to interview people. I had to actually learn to not be afraid of people first.
I'm still a little afraid of people, but you're not afraid of people anymore?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I had to learn to not, to interview someone, you have to ask them questions, you have to approach them, and so I had to learn those skills. I knew respect for journalists and just how much work it takes and how much openness and the people I met were remarkable. Not only people who worked with animals, farmers and ranchers and hunters, and but then all the people who made the materials, so the artisans and the tanners and all those people. It was a fascinating project. Maybe what I'll read is what you suggested, because it was a really good suggestion, and because my friend Lorna Milne is in the audience. And during the first chapter, which is leather, it's divided up into 6 materials: leather, wool, fur, feathers, pearls, silk. And the first one's leather, and so I'll just read the first paragraph of it. Lorna took me with her to visit this Yupik village where she used to teach, and who are renowned for what they call their skin sewing, sewing with leather. So, the secrets of skin sewing. My friend Lorna is wearing an apple green corduroy parka lined with a recycled down one. The ruff around its hood made of wolf fur, sewn for her by a Yupik woman she met when she was teaching in the Alaska tundra 25 years ago. Rarely is it cold enough, even here in Montana, for her to wear it. But at noon today, when we meet for lunch, it is 10 below. She tells me that the woman had sent her to the village to get the trim, hearing that a relative had brought in a wolf, a rare occurrence. The coat's ruff is thick, formidable, silver and black, about a hand's length long. Lorna says she once wore the coat into a nearby art museum, and the woman in the gift shop glared at her. People in the West have strong feelings about wolves, pro and con.
I think we can open up this conversation to our friends out there. We'll acknowledge them now. And maybe bring up the house lights. And Joe, who was our great introducer, has the microphone if anybody would like to wield it. Oh, no, except no, you. No. Just kidding.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I've spent time with you twice, and you have such a calming, soothing effect. I sort of want to be with you all the time, so I'm sorry I don't like people. But my question is, I was thinking about what you were saying about you've written some fiction, you've written this nonfiction book now, and perhaps poetry is some liminal, in-between kind of area. But when I listen to your poems on the choke cherry or the beach and the Scrabble board, I'm wondering if those are, and I don't expect you to go into any detail, but are those things that are actually happening in your life, or is that partly fiction that flows into it? And sort of what is your relationship with poetry and sort of fiction and nonfiction, I guess, is kind of how those are different and how they work for you in your poetry, I guess.
I don't write any fiction I realize that I think fiction is, I read lots of fiction. I love it. I think you have to be a storyteller. You have to think in that way of storytelling to be a good fiction writer. For instance, Deborah Erling is a good friend of mine. If you ever hang out with Deborah Erling, she just one story after another is coming out of her. It's fascinating. She thinks of life in story. I see life more in image, and so poetry has always been something that is something I feel at home in, and nonfiction is closer, I think, actually to poetry than fiction is, because you are paying attention. You're using the same skills in any kind of writing, I think. You're looking, you're using your senses, you're using image, you're looking at the music of the language, you're looking at clarity of the sentence, those kind of things. But fiction has that additional thing to it, and music has the additional thing of the music. So I guess it's where you put your focus in. I like writing essays. Long things are harder.
Thank you for everything. My name is Katya, and I was just wondering, I don't have to answer this, but it just popped up and came to me. Do you ever write something, publish it, share it, and then later, do you ever have regrets about something you've done?
Do you ever write something, publish it, and regret having published it, essentially, or having sent it out into the world and shared it?
Sure.
Yes.
My first novel, actually, when it went out of print, I went on Amazon and I tried to buy it all at once. I have a big box of them.
I think that's a natural evolution. I mean, you talk about the poetry you were writing when you were younger, or, I mean, I look back on I wrote a lot of poetry in high school and college, and stories that I was writing in my early 20s, and they are just garbage. They're terrible. And I thought they were so good. And I think that delusion is an important part of the process as well.
And there's a good break on that, in that, and I don't think it's there anymore, actually, is that you're sending things out. I mean, it takes a long time to get the first poem published. It takes, for me, it probably took 10 years before someone took one of my poems. I mean, can you believe people keep doing it when I am? It's amazing, but it takes a long time for you to get good enough for people to recognize that they want to publish your work. Now there's the internet, and so I think you could, just go, I love this poem, I'm going to post it, and or I'm going to share it with, a million people, And maybe that's good and bad because poetry is a great thing to have in the world anyway, but I think that's stopped the really, really bad poems from being out because no one would do it. And that's a whole other thing to talk about, I think, for people who are writers. It's just that process of rejection and how long it does take, how much suffering.
Well, it goes back to the must you write. I mean, and I think that if you feel that you must, you do.
Yeah.
And you keep.
Because there's a difference between wanting to write and wanting to be a writer. And you have to want to write.
Mm-hmm. And I've said often, you know, if I didn't have to, it is a really cruel career in a lot of ways. As far it's mean spirited, and there's a lot. It's beautiful. But I mean, I think like a lot of art, there's rejection involved, and there's questions, and it takes a long time, and it takes refinement.
And I feel like a bad person if people don't accept, they didn't accept my 5 poems. I'm ruined, I'm a bad person. Look, if you bake a loaf of bread, you go, maybe it was better yesterday than when you did it today, but you don't feel like you're a complete failure. People aren't out there to reject it.
Yeah. Throwing the bread back in your face.
And writing a note about it.
Yeah, thanks, but no thanks for the bread. It doesn't taste good. It's great. We really love our careers. Everyone should be writers. Any other questions?
Hi, thanks so much for being here and doing this. I'm curious how much of a poem for you is written before you get to the page and how much of it happens on the page. And what is it that you bring to the page that sparks it or starts it?
And again, it's my process. Everyone does it so differently. I have so many, I've had so many students who only compose on the screen. And I craft on the screen, but I never compose on the screen. And so actually, once I have an idea of, something's forming and I have a direction I want to go, I usually am writing by hand in a notebook. I'm trying to see what is being said or communicated. And sometimes that means that I'm not writing, I'm going out and encountering, I'm looking for the encounter that is going to help that poem get to the place it wants to go. For instance, I'm writing a poem called, for instance, like The Aspen Path. I have to go out there, and see what's being said. I have to keep going out until I kind of understand what wants to be said in the poem. I know that sounds a little kooky.
You're listening.
But you're listening, and you're listening. Consciousness really is an inner outer thing, and so you're looking out, you're seeing what you're sensing, but you're also paying attention to what you're responding to and how you're responding to that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that process that begins. There's no other word, I think, except it's an imaginative process. It's creativity. So that's usually how I do it, and I have no control over how long that will take. The easiest way to kill a poem is to strive.
That's a good
Don't you
quote.
think?
Yeah, well, and
There's something about the imagination that's just gonna stop.
I mean, I think that's true of storytelling though, too. I mean, I think that rushing is the easiest way to, I mean, you might get it done, but it's not the
Or you
version it
might
needs
force
to be.
it, force it into.
Yeah. I think we can take one more question if anyone's itching to. We have a taker. Right here.
While you were speaking, and you can hear me, right?
Yes.
The concept of how things come, do you ever feel like there's people out there helping you, guides, or, somehow a little woo-woo there, but still, I'm just wondering, do you ever feel as though there's other entities or other forces or something that connect with you?
I wrote an essay I wrote a book of essays just about the imaginal, or I call it the imaginal life. And one thing that I started with was the idea that most poets, I don't know about most writers, but most poets, I think, are really going after the feeling of when another voice takes over. What you call that voice, we probably all have different ideas about that. You might call it the imagination, you might call it the muse, you might call it the deer, you might call it spirit, I think that's what you're saying, or the dead, or something, but another voice comes through that surprises you, because if you were just writing in the voice that you have, it's not that exciting, that voice, and what you want is something that thrills you, that you go, where is that coming from? And that has some kind of, or you could call it the unconscious. You can call that voice many different things. People have. But the excitement comes that something else is coming in, and something beyond you. That's what I think poetry really is about, and is why people so much love it. What about fiction?
I think that there are definitely, I think that when it's really flowing, there is this, and again, who knows what you call it, but it does feel like a conduit of some sorts. There's a flow of language and ideas that I could not consciously, and just logically explain how it happens. And a lot of that is in the process, like as it is happening.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I think about, there's probably lots of writers in this room, and did you ever see that movie, The Hours? They have that one part of it was Virginia Woolf, and you're going, how can you think a movie of a novelist? They're just sitting there, That's what we do. Just sit, There's no drama to it, but there's all this stuff that's invisible that's going on there. Yeah.
Something's happening.
Something's happening.
We can't explain it.
Hard to explain. Anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for being here.